Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Right for Impact Communicating Research Through Policy Briefs. My name is Tiffany Nam. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with the Agricultural Genomics Action Center, or AGACT. We're very pleased to host today's session and have you all here today. For those of you who may be new to AGACT, we're an innovative knowledge mobilization hub supporting Genome Canada's Climate Smart Agriculture and Food Systems research portfolio. AGACT is a pan-Canadian initiative that operates across 4 partner institutions, including Simon Fraser University, or SFU, where both our speaker today and myself are based. As we gather today, we acknowledge that SFU is located on the unceded traditional Coast Salish lands, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. Before we begin, I have some quick housekeeping notes for everyone. Please feel free to share your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring them throughout the session as they come in and to answer them throughout the session and also at the end for Q&A. Closed captions in French and English are both available, and you can enable them at the bottom of your screen. This webinar also serves as an entry point to AGAC's Policy and Briefs and Practice program, with intake launching today. So you'll hear more about the program across our communications channels, including LinkedIn and our newsletter. So we encourage you to subscribe. Links will be posted in the chat very shortly. And today's session will be recorded and posted on AGAC's YouTube channel within the next week and shared with everyone who registered. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Zafar Adeel. Dr. Zafar Adeel is Director of the School of Sustainable Energy Engineering at SFU and serves as Executive Director of SFU's Pacific Water Research Center. He has over 25 years of experience in a broad range of environmental science and policy issues, including 18 years as a senior United Nations official focused on international development and research. From 2006 to 2016, he served as the director of United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health. He has held several international leadership roles. These include chairing UN Water from 2010 to 2012 and co-chairing the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Team of scientists that produced the Global Desertification Synthesis in 2005. His research focuses on the intersection of water security, technological innovation, and community-engaged research. He's also the book series editor for Springer's Water Security in a New World. We're very excited to learn from his experience today. With that, now I'll turn it over to you, Adeel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I think we'll have some very interesting conversation today, and hopefully you will take away some information that will be practically useful in whatever roles you're playing professionally. So before we start, I would like to also add my own acknowledgement that I'm at the SFU's Surrey campus. This is located on the traditional unceded territories of Semiahmoo, Kitsi, Coquitlam, Kikite, Kwantlen, and Tsawwassen First Nations. So we are always recognizing where we are, and this is part of how we operate. This is part of our work, and at SFU, this is part of our academics and research as well. So we will spend some time understanding how to communicate to policy audiences, particularly how to write policy briefs, and do that in a way which is impactful. And as we go through, I would be happy to entertain any questions you have. I don't mind stopping and explaining if there are terms or descriptions that I'm using which are unfamiliar to you. Please jump in. I'd be happy to stop and have a more interactive conversation as we go through. Also, I will be using Slido as a tool for creating a bit of interactivity and trying to better understand where you're coming from. So if you're unfamiliar, I will flash a QR code in a minute, and that will allow you to either go to the website or download the Slido application on your smartphone. So with that, let's dive right in. The first action is going to be to do this first poll, and I would like to understand what your prior knowledge is. So there's this QR code on the right, on the left-hand side that you can scan, or you can go to slido.com, and the password is brief 2026, which is at the bottom left-hand side. And so I would like you to pick any of these choices. Uh, how do you characterize your prior knowledge of policy interfaces to research? You have some exposure, you have no clue, you've worked closely with policymakers, you're an expert level policy maker or policy formulator, and maybe you actively avoid doing anything to do with policy. And by the way, these are um anonymized, so please be very candid in whatever you communicate. I'll give maybe another minute or so for those who are logging in. Okay, I think there's a few more people still working on it, so please keep doing that. But I think we're generally getting some idea of a majority of people having had some exposure to policy, but don't really understand how it works very well. Um, and some people who have actually had active experience and would like to learn more. So I think all of those perspectives are good. And of course, there's a few folks who have not had this exposure before, which is fine. I think we'll try to get everyone up to the same page. So here's what I will do is I'll start with talking about some fundamentals of policy formulation. What are some of the triggers that policy responses are initiated? Some practical tips for how we go about engaging policymakers. Who actually is a policymaker, and what are you expected to provide them? What are the mechanisms for engaging them? And some what if questions that a lot of people have in their minds when dealing with policy audiences. And then we'll get into the writing techniques for policy audiences, and that's where we will spend perhaps bulk of the time. And we'll also look at some examples of what these policy briefs look like, and what kind of impact and outcomes they create. And then I'll close off with some lessons learned. So as we go through this discussion, what I hope you will achieve is that you'll understand the general nature of policy formulation and implementation. You'd understand what kind of timescales are required for policy responses. And you will also be able to identify different types of policy audiences. What are some of the characteristics and requirements of policymakers? Some of the effective ways of engaging with them, and of course, policy briefs is going to be the central mechanism that we'll spend most of our time discussing today. And you will also be able to understand and explore this interface between research and policy from a researcher's perspective. So, what is it that you need to do? What are some of the common challenges? And what are some tips and approaches for overcoming those challenges? But that's kind of how this session will proceed, and hopefully you will have these additional skills by the end of it. Okay, let's create a word cloud. And if you can use just one word, what is your gut reaction when you consider the translation of your own research in for policy audiences? So I believe I have a 20 character limit, so you can't have long descriptions, but it's always very interesting to see what pops up. So to state the obvious, the more a word gets repeated, the larger it gets. Well, thank you very much for participating. Please continue to type if you are already typing. I will share these slides with the organizers at Ag Act, and you would be able to see these outcomes of these polls. So it's always quite interesting to see what we get, and each group I do this with has a different kind of emphasis. And here you see the engagement of your research output with policy audiences. Most of the words we are seeing pop out are positive. So you're thinking of impact. You're hopeful that it will create impact. It is essential. That's true, and you have to be able to convey the major findings to policy audiences, and you have to do that with a lot of clarity, so that your message is getting across, and we'll unpack how that happens. And now let's look at some of the other expressions. So there's tentative excitement. That's great. There's also on the other end of the spectrum, lack of understanding, unsure, unclear, and also some thoughts about relevance, bridging the knowledge gap, resonating with audiences, etc. Red tape, that's an interesting one. Right. Well, like I said, thank you very much for participating. I think it gives us a starting point for our conversation. So let's dive right in and think about who are we thinking about when we are considering policy, and what indeed is policy in the first place. So I'll do this, and many of you might already know it, but I'll say it for the sake of completeness and just to ensure that everyone is on the same page. So a policy is a set of statements of principles, values, and intent. And it essentially outlines expectations and provides a basis for consistent decision making, and that includes resource allocation or a specific issue. And in any institution, so any organization, any company that you work with will have a set of policies. And these are the tools of governance of an institution. And typically, when we think about policy, we're also thinking of politicians, governments, and all that, which is also true. But policy actually thrives on a whole spectrum, from very localized application to national and international landscape. What are the ingredients of a good policy? It is clearly written. It is inclusive and holistic in understanding and responding to the topic that it is trying to address. And it's also acknowledging institutional culture and values. In other words, it's not just something that's created in a vacuum, but it actually is subservient to the context in which it is created. And what you would prefer is that a policy is technology independent. So it should be flexible enough that it incorporates new things as they come along. And we have tested these in the last few years. So, for example, I'm at a university, and we have policies for academic integrity. Now, we never included large language models in the rules and principles that we set around integrity. So many of those policies had to be rewritten so that they're now also incorporating the new technology and different AI tools that all of us have available. Now, policy formulation is a circular process. So if we start on the top of the circle, we identify an issue or a problem, we conduct some research, we generate what different solutions might work. We undertake some reviews, we consult people on whether our solutions are on the right track. And once we've done that, we finalize the policy, we start implementing it. And as we start implementing, we are also monitoring to see that whether it's achieving its desired objectives or not. And as a result of that monitoring and evaluation, we might assess that what we thought we would be doing is actually not happening. So we might need to redefine our issue or redefine the problematic that we're trying to solve. Now, typically, we would say policy knowledge is knowledge in the service of problems defined by clients. And let's unpack this expression a little bit. So we are defining we're using a problem which is defined by the client, and we're trying to serve that specific problem. And so you're gathering existing information. Sometimes you're creating new information and knowledge. Uh, but a lot of times you're relying on pre-existing scientific and professional knowledge. And that means that you're actually trying to address a problem in the right way, and you're not trying to force fit existing information into a solution that you think might work. So force fitting data into the findings that you would like is not the right way to go about policy formulation. And that brings us to this notion of fit for purpose policy. And that means that you're basically creating a policy which is correct, meaning that you have correctly identified a problem, and you also have correctly identified a solution. The solution that you've developed is pragmatic. It is doable. It's practical. It's going to be effective, meaning that what you're trying to achieve will actually be achieved. And that's where correctness of the problem and your solution comes into play. And you also have to serve your clients and patrons. And so you shouldn't go off on a tangent and come up with something which is totally different in the perspective of clients. So that client orientation is always there in policymaking. And your interventions are going to actually bring about change and the right kind of change, I might add. So just putting the components together doesn't really mean that you will end up with the right solution. It has to be fit for purpose. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind. Now, how do policy processes get triggered? And there's many triggers. Sometimes there are multiple triggers for the same policy, and they are listed here in no particular order. So a lot of time, policy is triggered by a philosophical or a political position, and I say philosophical because it might be tied to the group or the political party or the organization has a particular bent in a particular direction, and that might drive the policy to say, okay, that's what we're going to do. So, for example, you're either in favor of addressing climate change or you think it's a big hoax. Those two positions will generate very different policies. If you look uh, south of the border in the White House, we've seen both of those extremes of political positions drive the climate policy that comes out of the White House. Sometimes extreme events and disasters are the ones that trigger a particular policy response. So this is typically reactive. So something bad has happened, and you want to fix that problem, and you want to make sure that it won't come back again. Another trigger is public pressure. So as you build awareness to a particular issue, there's lots of public debate. There's coverage in different media, in social media. You'll see a lot of discussion, and that creates public pressure. And particularly in democracies, uh, that public pressure is something that typically generates a response. Another type of trigger is an economic impact. So this could be an adverse impact, or this could also be a positive impact where you're seeing an enhanced return on investment and say, oh, yeah, we should do something to capture this positivity. Or there has been, as you might have noted in the last couple of decades, there have been some serious economic impacts, and then you start to react to those. So either which way, you end up with a policy response. There's, of course, lobbying by special interest groups. And while we are thinking of lobbyists working in Ottawa or in Washington, D.C., but these lobbyists you will find also in smaller organizations, and they might have different agendas that they're trying to push through. And again, that might trigger a particular type of policy response. And last but not least is new emerging scientific evidence. And as we go towards the end of this conversation and we start to look at some of the examples, we'll find out that scientific evidence, which is kind of our objective today, is to convert scientific evidence into policy response, is sometimes not the first thing that triggers a policy response. If the scientific evidence is so strong that it kind of hits you in the face and you have no choice but to respond to it, that will trigger an immediate policy response. More typically, scientific evidence builds up gradually, and the responses also build up gradually. So it takes a bit of time for the scientific evidence to lead to a policy impact. And there are ways that we as researchers and scientists can undertake some actions to accelerate and expedite that process, and we'll cover those in a few moments. Okay, so let's talk about policymakers themselves, and I'll share some practical tips on how to engage with them. As you noted in the very kind introduction by Tiffany at the beginning, I did work for the UN for almost 2 decades, and I did have the privilege of dealing with politicians and policymakers all the way from the small local village to international scene at the UN headquarters in New York. So this is kind of my synthesis of how to engage policymakers. And actually, let's start by asking you, who do you consider to be a policymaker? Is it a politician? Is it bureaucrat, head of a government agency, diplomats, senior UN officials, think tank heads? What do you think? Okay, I think we see a pattern emerging. So most people think heads of government agency, politicians, bureaucrats are the type of people that would be considered policymakers. And there's a few who think others also play that role. And in fact, all of these people can be in a policymaking role, and so they will be considered policymakers. So again, thank you for participating, and I will share back these results with you. Okay, so as I was saying, all of these people that we just picked can be policymakers, and they have some common characteristics that are, I think, useful for us to understand because we are trying to engage them and we are trying to convince them to do something that we think is important. So their common characteristics are they have typically limited or almost no domain knowledge. So what you're very passionate about, they may not really know anything about it, or they know a little bit about it, which might be a double-edged sword. So it might be risky that they have incorrect information, and you might have to provide some course correction there. They're also juggling a whole range of issues, and their interest in those issues varies over time and varies depending on the situation. So something that they think is very important today, and that happens to align with your interest, tomorrow something else comes up and they'll totally drop it like a hot potato and move on to something else. So they're keep in mind that what you think is most important, that may not be the most important thing, and there might be a dozen other things that they're trying to juggle. They're also keen about self-preservation. So they do not want to put themselves in a risky situation or take a position that will come and bite them in the back. So they want to be very careful. Almost all of them are smart enough that they would uh, take this course of action that will lead to self-preservation. They're also very sensitive to their constituents. So now, if you're a government official, your constituents would be the politicians primarily, and maybe secondarily the citizens. If you're a politician, your constituents would be those in your voters in your constituency. But it actually varies, and you might have to drill through to identify who the constituents are. And in every case, they are going to be sensitive to their constituency, and they would not try to do things which might put them in a bad picture with their constituents. And they're always short on time. And so, you have to be on your toes in being able to respond to them. What is it that they expect you to provide them? Okay, so this is, I think, the perhaps the most important and central piece for you to take note. They want to get key evidence. They want that evidence to be supported by facts, research, and experts. And it could be any combination of those that you can pull together. They want you to evaluate different scenarios and outcomes, and they want to ensure that those are realistic and feasible. And so they don't want really pie in the sky type solutions which will not work or which are not feasible because the resources are not available. So they're a big fan of realistic and feasible solutions. Now, unlike what we might think, they are also keen to know what the competing narratives are. And I think in our writing, typically we tend to focus on what we think is the best solution. They would certainly like to know that, but they also want to understand what else is cooking and what other narratives are there. And if your position or your policy advice or recommendations are based on solid evidence, then you shouldn't fear providing other competing narratives to say, yes, there's other people saying other things, but what we are proposing is based on solid science and solid research. They want to be able to make informed and defensible decisions, and they want us or scientists to help them make those defensible decisions. And as I said, they're short on time, so they want to receive information in a politically expedient time frame. And that time frame can be sometimes very short. So you might get a phone call in the morning that by 3 p.m. I need to get a paragraph on something, on some particular issue. What is the current state of science? So it can be that immediate. Uh, but in any event, even if it's a longer study, etc., so they're always pushing to get the earliest possible answers so that they can go back to their constituents and claim that they've created an evidence-based policy position that's going to address their problems. Okay. So please, by the way, feel free to pop in any questions or any comments. I'm looking at the chat box if anything comes up in your mind. Okay, so how do we go about strategizing communicating with these policy audiences? So, as with any exercise that involves communication, the first step is to identify the specific audience that you're trying to address. And when I say specific, this can be very specific. So it can be an individual, it can be a minister, it can be an assistant deputy minister, or it can be a particular UN official. The more specific you make it, the better off you're going to be. You have to decide what you're trying to do. What is the narrative that you're trying to convey? What are the actions your research should result in? And so you have to have this clarity of mind in terms of what is it that you're trying to convey. You have to identify two or at the most three main messages that you might want to convey, and you have to stick to those. Uh, you have to create an outline that conveys your messages the best, and you have to select information that only pertains to or reinforces your messages. So it is understandable if you're an expert in your field, you have lots of other information, you have other pieces of knowledge that you think are interesting. But in this case, it's not the interest that you want to trigger. You want to trigger an action, and that has to come from the messages that you're trying to make. And you basically, at the end of the day, have to have some kind of an elevator pitch. So something that you can describe in under a minute of what your messages are. So it has to be really that sharply honed when you're trying to engage with the policymakers. Being passive doesn't really get the message across. So putting your policy briefs on a table is not going to work. Even if you add signs that says take one, that's not going to work. So you have to be a little bit more proactive. What are some of the ways in which we engage policymakers? And here, this is a prioritized list. The most impactful and the best way is to actually have a face-to-face meeting with a policymaker or a politician. Uh, when it is a targeted meeting, you know the issue that you're addressing. You should have all the information in front of you, and you have to have your elevator pitch sharpen enough that it will create an impact. The next level down is to create high profile publications or targeted policy briefs. Now, these are publications, and of course, we'll unpack how policy briefs are created in a few moments. Um, these are targeted publications, or they end up being very high profile. So, something that's published in Science, for example, or it makes the headlines in primetime news, for example. So that's the kind of profile I'm talking about. Policy briefs are typically more targeted, so an ideal policy brief might be just about a page that you can slip under somebody's nose, and it looks nice. It has some graphics, it has some data, it has some recommendations, all of that very compactly presented. Most of the policy briefs would end up being significantly longer than that, but that's still an impactful way of doing that. The next level down is to engage with media. And this is where you're being interviewed by journalists. Your story is being picked up by different newspapers, by media outlets. So you're on 6 p.m. news, for example, or you're being picked up by radio, by CBC or other radio stations. Uh, that still creates a wave, and it helps. Um, the challenge with that is that in terms of reaching your target audience, it's a bit hit and miss. So you're hoping that the minister would be sitting in front of their TV when the 6 o'clock news comes on, or there's coincidentally they have their radio turned on when they're driving to work and they listen to your sales pitch. So it's a bit of a hit and miss. So it's that's why I've ranked it lower down. The next approach is to engage in public events. So you can have seminars, conferences, and where you have mixed audience typically. Now, if you can bring, for example, a minister to your conference at the opening ceremony, and you can make them sit and listen to your spiel, then that would be just perhaps as good as having a targeted meeting with them. But that's actually quite rare that that happens. So again, that's why public events are a good way to stir up public conversation, and so you're changing public opinion. And as we noted earlier, that can trigger policy responses, but you're now two steps removed from creating that policy response. Okay, we'll now dive into policy briefs. Maybe I'll pause here to see if anyone has a question before we dive headfirst and start talking about policy briefs. Anything that we've discussed so far. You can either type your question in, or I don't mind even if you unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, well, I'll keep on going, but hopefully that uh, will help break the ice. Okay, so we have a question from Elizabeth. So do you have advice on how to create connections to policymakers? Yeah, I think for researchers, typically serving on different committees and advisory groups is one way to get into the policy circles. I think it takes a bit of investment of time, but it actually gets you closer to policy audiences and policymakers. Um, Going and attending events that they are organizing is another way. It's a little bit more indirect, but again, that might help you create a network that eventually gets you into the policy circles. So there's no kind of single magic bullet, but that gets you, in there. Okay, and if you don't have an existing relationship, it's a follow-up question by Elizabeth. How does one obtain a meeting? Now, it partly depends on your organizational settings. Like if you're at a research institute or a university, or even a consulting company, for example, you would be able to seek an audience with the policy maker or that you're trying to go after. It might be possible if you're not already well connected, then you might get the next best option. So you might get the minister's parliamentary secretary, or you might get an MP in your area to listen to you. So if that's the level of policy engagement that you're thinking about. In other cases, like if you're thinking of the head of a think tank, it might actually be easier to get an audience with them, and so just to reach out. Right. Thank you for this question, Neelima. We're going to unpack some tips about uh, the mistakes researchers might make in writing policy briefs, and there's quite a few, and I think maybe the starting point is to unlearn what we have learned, because writing for policy audiences is going to be quite different. But just wait for a moment as we go through, and we'll go through it systematically and try to figure out how to address them. Lenore has a question. Uh, Policy audience, yes, yeah. When I say policy audience, I'm kind of using it as a synonym for policymaker. So policy audience is slightly wider. So it's the sort of the ecosystem around policymakers. So a policymaker might be a handful of individuals or a particular single individual, but they have a constellation of people around them that influence that policymaking process. So that's what I refer to collectively as a policy audience. All right, so let's uh, walk down and uh, talk about writing for policy audiences and creating a policy brief. So my key message here is unlearn everything you've learned. And I'm deliberately being a bit provocative because writing for policy audiences is unlike academic writing. So some of the key differences are that the style is very different. And so something that you'll have to watch for is readability index, and I'll explain that in a second what that is. Uh, the structure of your writing is almost upside down. So you start with your conclusions and you describe why you're making those conclusions. And so, in our minds, when we are writing a scientific publication, we'll describe the issue, we'll provide background, we'll provide our methodology, we'll provide our research outputs, we'll analyze the outputs, and then we'll come out with recommendations or conclusions. Here, we'll start with conclusions, and your big a ticket item gets to be presented up front. So again, it takes a bit of learning to do this. The emphasis is on interpretation and analysis. And so they may not even be interested in looking at the hardcore underlying data, but they're more interested in your interpretation and analysis. You have to list your proposed actions and their outcomes and scenarios. And so this goes back to the point I was making earlier that they want to be not making decisions that would put them at risk, and they want to be seen as addressing all possible outcomes. And so you have to provide them a listing of different types of actions, and you also have to describe what each of those actions would lead to. And hopefully they'll pick the right action. So instead of being very prescriptive, you have to be descriptive in terms of what their options are. And the other major difference is that you have to be quite short and succinct in providing your advice to them. So no policymaker has, a lot of time to read. So the more compact you can make it, the better off you are. So here's the readability index. There's a few which are available. This is my favorite because it gets you the the ease of readability. So it looks at the number of words in a sentence, and it also looks at the number of syllables in a word. So if you're using more complicated words and you're using long sentences, it will increase your fog index. And typically, you select about 100-word passage and you put it in, and there's now tools online that will give you the readability index. So the other reason why I like this is that it roughly correspond to the grade level. And so uh, if your fog index is 14, you're basically targeting an undergraduate. And I'll circle back to this point again. Typically, we're trying to write for an eighth or ninth grader. So your fog index should be 8, 9, or at the most 10. And so, and this is quite serious. So you have to make sure that your writing is quite compact and you're not using flowery sentences and flowery words just to make it look more impressive. Actually, simplicity will get your impact much greater. So this is one of the tips in response to Neelima's question. Okay. Um, Aram has a question that is there a difference between a policy and a policy brief? Yes, there's a big difference. So policy brief is a short document that would describe a particular position on how a particular objective can be achieved. A policy is a document that will be created in response and how to actually achieve that. So your policy brief becomes the trigger for creating a policy, but policy would come afterwards. Okay. So we kind of went over this already that you have to decide your objective and you have to have key messages. Uh, Here's some other tips to keep in mind. So avoid technical jargon. You have to maybe have a friend or your siblings or your parents read the policy brief that you created and have them see what kind of reaction they get. It, I always advise people not to use acronyms. Instead, define and spell out the terms. Uh, Even if it takes a little bit more space, it's actually a good practice to not uh, sort of be drawn into the jargon of and the acronym game. You have to write in a conversational style. So you go from one end of the issue to the other and back. So if you uh, pick up any newspaper story or any media story these days, it would start with maybe a story of an individual of what has impacted them, and then they start to unpack this story, and then at the end of the story, they come back and say, here's the problem that triggered the issue that we described at the beginning of the story. So that conversational style helps you. You can use subheadings to break the information into bite-size. Uh, and again, we typically advise not to put in a huge citation list. You can have a few endnotes or footnotes. So again, pick the publication which is most significant as a citation. And you have to use visuals whenever possible because they can be quite impactful. And I'll show you a couple of examples in a second. Uh, Infographics that I think most of us are familiar with are a compact way of communicating, and you can pack in actually quite a lot of information. So again, I advise folks to use, uh, whenever it's possible, convert your text into a graphical form, which grabs people's attention, and it's easy on the eye. Now, some other tips also to keep in mind. You always have to lead with your best shot, as I said before. So your most punchy conclusion should be the first thing that the reader reads. And the writing style should be such that each paragraph has its own headline. So you have the most punchy finding within the paragraph, again, rising to the top of the paragraph, make it bold, make it visible, readable, etc. Always write in active voice. And I think that's a general tip, also useful in scientific writing, that active voice takes up less space and is more direct. Uh, these days, I think it's easy to go to any AI tool and make sure that you don't have any grammatical errors in your policy-facing outputs and your policy briefs. A few other practical tips. Don't put in odd ratios. Don't say 3.567 is the ratio of something to another, but rather convert it to whole numbers and say, 1 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. Or you can use percentages and say, 35% is that's a good way to do it. Now, again, as scientists, we try to convince our audience about the strength uh, of our scientific evidence by saying, "Oh, the R square is 0.82 or zero point 0.9 or whatever is the norm for your particular field." Never do that. So provide the level of confidence that you have, and there are guides online available that will allow you to convert an R square value into a high level of confidence, low level of confidence, et cetera, et cetera. So the your policymaker and generally the policy audience are interested in understanding how sure you are that what you're claiming is actually based on scientific evidence. So this level of confidence is a way of getting that across. Um, I already mentioned use round numbers. Don't try to get into fractions, and uh, feel free to include quotes. Like if you're addressing a problem that impacts people, you're doing something with public transport. Include quotes from some people who use public transport commonly, or you're uh, uh, trying to reach out a new agricultural based genome out to the farmers. You can pick up quotes from some farmers and convey those to the Minister of Agriculture to say, look, the farmers really think that this is a great idea to use this particular strain. I think I alluded to this earlier. Ask several people to review your final polished draft. And looking at the picture on the right, some of them might have not a very pleasant reaction. So please be prepared for that. So ask those people, and preferably these would be lay audiences, people who are not in the field. So is it accessible? Can you read it? Is the key message clear? Are the arguments persuasive? And I do this quite often. I take it to my kids and my wife to say, well, what do you think? Does that does that make sense? And revise as many times as necessary. In my case, I after the first couple of iterations, I would actually maybe print it out and whip out a red pen and start editing. So I'm kind of old-fashioned that way. Again, these days, AI tools can help you, but again, be mindful that they can sometimes create superfluous or maybe even fake comments or fake arguments, which are not based in reality. So again, you have to be extra cautious if you're using AI for anything more than just language editing. Okay, so here are some examples of infographics. So I'll go through these relatively quickly. Uh, so there's the purpose we are doing this is that you can uh, demonstrate in a very compact space a lot of information. It's useful that you don't oversaturate the number of trends and data points, and make it more accessible, clearly label your graphs. So I'm using here an example below from one of the policy briefs that I created more than 20 years ago, and it is still being used. So I use this as an example. So it basically gives you a percentage of total land area in a particular category: rangeland, croplands, urban areas, and then it gets distributed according to the types of water availability, whether it's arid, semi-arid, dry, subhumid, etc. Okay, so again, it creates a nice impact of delivery. Now, this is my favorite one, and again, came out in the same policy brief 20 years ago, and this is still being used in conference presentations to define the size of drylands on the global map. And on the bottom middle part, there is a description of percentages by land surface, and it also has the corresponding population in each of the areas. So you can immediately go to the light green and figure out, oh, there's about 15% of the global population lives in these areas, and they're about 8.5% of the global surface area. So I think these are kind of very strong, impactful ways of getting your information across in one snapshot. Now, if I were to write this up, I would say it would probably take 2 pages of text to convey all of this information effectively across. Right. Here's another one which is used quite often, which is this notion of planetary boundaries. This was originally a concept that was developed in late 1990s, and it has persevered. And there's actually, I haven't used it here, but there's even a 2025 version of this wagon wheel, which shows you how bad things are and whether we are in a safe boundary, which is the green area, and whether we are going out and going beyond the capacity in terms of, for example, nitrogen and phosphorus going into the atmosphere. We've exceeded the natural system's capacity. So again, in a flash, you are able to see all of the global issues at one glance. Now, here's some what if questions that a lot of people might ask. And particularly if you haven't had policy experience, I would not be surprised if you're asking these questions. What if I'm not a respected expert within my field? And I would say if for that particular issue, you've done your homework and you have the evidence base, you are on your way to becoming the respected expert, and that shouldn't hold you back at all. And many times I've had the opportunity to have a grad student, for example, create some very impressive outputs that can be put right in front of a policymaker. So being a respected expert is not necessary. A second question is, what if I'm not attached to a well-known institution? Again, it would probably have some constraints on your ability to engage media or to engage audiences. But if you have a strong message and it's based on solid evidence, you might find that journalists are beating your door down and they might be actually trying to get in touch with you. And again, so having you attached to a well-known institution helps, but that is not an absolute requirement. Okay. The next one is what if you really want to just bring in attention to an issue? I don't really want a policy change, but I want people to be aware of a problem. And I would say if that's the question you're asking, then you've probably lost the game, because that's not what we would advise that you go after. Uh, Policy audiences would not appreciate that you're uh, just informing them about something and not really have any follow-up and don't really have recommendations. You don't really have any ideas to address the problem. And in that case, a more self-serving policymaker or politician might say, "Oh, just keep it to yourself. What do I do with this?" And another question might be, what if I don't have time to do all the research about my audience and the policy context? Again, if that is the situation, then there's a great risk that what you're trying to do may not be accomplished because you haven't done the homework in connecting with the folks that you mean to be connecting with and with the right policy context. Okay, so these are some of the what if questions that might come up. So uh, I was going to pause here before I get into a couple of case studies of policy briefs. So, Lenore, your question is quite on time. And I invite others to pop in your questions as well. Okay, so the question is, do you have suggestions to include a graphic? Also make sure the brief is accessible to policy on a screen reader, vision problems. More common to include a web page. Uh, so the two separate questions, whether we can uh, create our policy brief in a way that it's accessible to the vision impaired. And the general answer is that we should be making any infographics quite visible, meaning that if you're looking at the same infographic on a smartphone, where it's quite compact as opposed to a large computer screen in front of you, it should still be legible, so that the text you have, for example, shouldn't shrink down to fine print that no one can read. So I think even if your audience are not visually impaired, you need to make sure that the visibility of your text is good. Um, and if you've done your homework, you would probably know if your audience does have visually impaired individuals, the ones that you're targeting, then you would want to take extra care to make sure everything is customized to that particular audience. Um, I'll use this question to give you another example. I had the privilege of serving as the chair of the Provincial Advisory Council for Community Living BC, which is a provincial organization that supports individuals with intellectual disabilities. And some of the people on that committee are self-advocates, meaning that they are individuals with intellectual disability themselves. So any document, any policy advice that we created in that committee had to pass through the test that the individuals that were sitting on the committee were able to understand it. And so you had uh, to deconstruct complicated terms, use plain language, and make sure your readability index was quite low. So again, you can really customize your policy brief to your audience. The next question was about including a web page alternative text. And the answer is yes, you can do that. And the most effective way, perhaps, is to include a QR code that will direct your individuals to that instead of having a URL. Um, you can assume that perhaps your whoever your audience is going to look at your policy brief online, but you cannot run with that assumption. Somebody might actually be printing it out and might have a hard copy in front of them. So that's where having a QR code is much more effective way of guiding them to a particular web page. So yes, you can do that, but the other qualifier I'll add is that at the end of the day, you want uh, the policy brief to be self-contained. So uh, you might say for more information, go somewhere else, but all your evidence should be in the policy brief itself. Okay. Oh, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Neelima. The question is, would you recommend engaging policymakers during a research project, and what stage would you involve them in? So it depends on the nature of the project, and I'll give you an example. I was working with an organization called Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which is a trilateral uh, partnership between US, Mexico, and Canada, between the three federal governments. And they wanted to know how well their countries are doing in capturing data in terms of economic impact of large-scale flooding. And what we wanted to do was to look at the data collection systems and provide responses and recommendations to the three federal governments in how well they should be addressing this process and how to improve it. And here's what we did. At the very first workshop, we had some representation from the three federal governments and asked them some questions about what we should do. And then we went away with the team in each country. We had this research project unfold over the next couple of years. And then we brought them in for a lesson finding and exploration workshop at the end. And we had a detailed discussion with them before we formulated policy briefs for each of the three governments. So you can engage policymakers. If they're not a regulator, they would be happy to come on board and be part of the conversation, and it would help you to make sure that the form in which your policy brief will come out at the end is going to be actually useful to them, because you want them to pick up the ball and run with it. So I think it helps to engage them in the middle of a project, maybe even at the start of the project. Certainly, you want to have them be engaged in some form or the other. You can even send them a draft of your policy brief before and say, "What do you think?" If they are amenable to provide you that kind of feedback. Okay, let's look at a few case studies. I'm mindful of time as well. We're getting close. So here's I'm going to look at briefly two or three policy briefs and uh, just to unpack on what the objective was, what triggered them, and how they were created, and what were the outcomes. So this one is, I think, might be familiar to many of you. Genome Canada put out this policy brief called Genomics for the Blue Economy. And it was an exercise to help the development of the Canadian Ocean Strategy and how genomics could play a role in it. And the trigger for it was the COVID-19 pandemic and this notion of Build Back Better that came out around 2020, 2021 was this idea that we want to be more resilient and robust in how our systems work. This was based on a national consultation process, and as you know, Genome Canada has its uh, daughter organizations in each of the provinces, and so they were creating these findings. So the outcomes were some specific recommendations, and here's an example of a recommendation to leverage and position genomics as part of this overall policy dialogue. And again, I picked this one, and all of the recommendations are written like this. The recommendation is a paragraph or a sentence, and the highlight of the paragraph, the headline is bolded. And this is the writing style that I was alluding to earlier, that you're making it very clear that it has to do with the creation and development of high quality jobs. So that's why you're doing this. It was connected to the Blue Economy consultation themes, which were prosperity, growth, and research advancement. So this policy brief contributed to those. And it also provided a link up to the Sustainable Development Goals. So it actually went a little bit beyond Canada and said how Canada is trying to achieve these international goals that can be done. Okay, so that's one example. Oh, and they also came out with an interesting slogan of their own. Instead of just saying build back better, they said build back bluer and better. So interesting. The second example is some work that I was involved with in Ontario, where the at the end of the economic crisis in 2008 and 9, the provincial government was looking at ways of making new green investments, and they wanted to increase the market size of the Ontario water industry. So there were a series of province-wide consultations. I was able to bring in some UN senior officials into the conversations, and so there was lots of collective evidence, and that actually led in a very short time to provincial legislation that was introduced in 2010, coupled with budget allocations in 2010. So there was a uh, very strong political interest. And so this policy brief got picked up very fast. And in about a year and a half, we had a provincial legislation, funds allocation, and this new mechanism called Water Technology Acceleration Project was created by the provincial government. So quite impactful. I was quite pleased with myself of having contributed to that in a small way. Uh, Fast forward a little bit. A decade later, the Conservative government came into power in Ontario. They decided to defund WaterTap and shut it down. So while over a decade, a lot of positive actions were created, the mechanism that came out from that legislation was shut down, because of another political angle that came out. Here's another example that I was involved with, which is at about the same time frame. In Ottawa, there was a think tank called National Roundtable on Economy and Environment. This was funded by the federal government. And one of the exercises it took was to uh, uh, undertake an analysis across different sectors and look at the impact of climate change on different sectors and what kind of future impacts might there be, and what are the some ways of creating holistic economic considerations and policies. And so this was done through sector by sector consultation. So manufacturing sector, chemical sector, agriculture, forestry, energy sector, uh, particularly the petro-based and the other energy sector, hydro-based, were all part of this. And it came out with media engagement, very prominent pick up by different news outlets and a lot of discussion that was generated. Again, fast forward a little bit, the conservative government was in power in 2013. They defunded and closed down NRT. And actually, what they initially tried to do was that they said all the documents that were created by NRT will be hidden behind a Freedom of Information Act wall. So, meaning you'd have to go and uh, ask for it legally to get access to that. Unfortunately, University of Ottawa stepped in and they said they're going to create a repository with all the publications, which were publicly funded in the first place, and they should be publicly available. But again, so there's a policy impact created in the very immediate term, but then there's some reversal by having a federal government with a different political angle coming in. So these are just some examples that came out. I'll go through a quick slide to summarize some lessons, and if you have other questions, please feel free to type them in, and I'll take them in before we conclude. So here's some key lessons to take away. In your policy brief and even in your underlying research, describe the theory of change. Uh, Define how you will get from where we are today to where you want to be. Connect the dots. And if you're uh, describing a multi-step process, describe ways in which each step of that process would unfold, and that will allow the reader and your audience to really understand how your proposed course of action works. Use well-defined and desirable outcomes as a way of measuring the success. And we typically use the SMART indicators, which I'm sure all of you would have heard. They should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. I will not dwell on those because those are common in almost any sector, any research field. But we shouldn't hesitate to use a narrative form as well. So sometimes things that will happen are not easily quantifiable, but you can still say the change in the situation, the change in a constituency, what would that look like? And so those outcomes you need to define in your policy brief. And just for yourself, consider the extensive timeframes. So typically, I would say anywhere from 5 to 10 years is the time it takes for a policy to take root and start being implemented. So going back to that cyclical nature, it takes a while for the policy brief to take impact. You might get extremely lucky, like I was showing you the example of this water legislation in Ontario. It might just unfold in slightly over a year, but that's very rare, actually. So that's it. That's all I wanted to cover. I'll stop here and see if you have any questions. Thank you, Aram. So the questions are there names for different kinds of policies that are used internally within an organization versus policy an organization creates and wants government to adopt? Yes, I think the policy frameworks or the policy context in which you're developing those will depend on the organizational context. So I'm at a university. We are regularly creating policies internally to, as I said, deal with academic integrity, for example, or the use of AI tools in the classroom. Uh, and so they will have kind of a regulatory angle to them, and there's a particular framing process through which these policies are pushed through, etc. So eventually, you have to have the Senate of the university approve it, or it might be the Board of Governors that have to approve a particular policy. Now, if you're targeting a political government, then that might be a different story that you're either looking for a legislation, maybe you're looking for an investment by a federal government in a particular issue. Um, and so the shape the ultimate policy will make might look quite different. So it might be just a policy that Prime Minister Carney is now investing in these large scale projects. So there's a policy document and there's a description for each of those projects. So it's not a legislation per se, but it's a government policy nonetheless. In other cases, it might go through the parliament and it comes out with an act of the parliament. And again, the form and the shape they will take will look very different on depending on which of those framing that you're going after. But I think that I hope that answers your question, Aram. Please feel free to circle back if it is not clear. Okay, Carrie has a question. In your experience, do the flashiest policy briefs get supported over the most important one or the one with the biggest impact? Um, yeah, I think being flashy and snazzy is not really doesn't really create the most impact. I think it's actually the strength of the evidence. Presenting it well helps, but that's not what's going to make or break a policy decision at the end of the day. So uh, the ones that will move things in the right direction, and oftentimes policymakers are fishing for evidence to back up something that they really want to do. And if you happen to align with that unspoken desire, then it might actually be fast-tracked, regardless of how simple it is in terms of its presentation. So again, depending on what is it that you're trying to do, who specifically is your audience, I think you'd have to tailor the format specifically to them. And you can look at history as well, recent history on what actually has stuck and what is uh, you know, what has created the most significant impact. Okay, Sammy, yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, so the question is if an elected administration can do a 180-degree flip and reverse the policies of a preceding information, what can experts do? Uh, I don't think there's any way that you can buy immunity to a policy to make sure that it will stick around forever. I think the strength of something is what actually works at the end of the day. And I'll give you a more common example, which is the so-called Obamacare. So the uh, in the first Trump administration, they tried very hard to flip it and replace it with something else. And just because it has some common sense elements that made it very difficult to flip that around. So even despite their best efforts, it's kind of stuck around. But again, there's no way of forecasting what the atmosphere will be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. Yeah, unfortunately there's no magic bullet that would get it cast in stone for forever. So yeah, I mean, as you say, bad luck happens. So that may be the reality of how things go. So you find it quite rare that policies uh, once defined are stuck with for very long periods of time. They always are modified over time. And so I think the underlying question is what can we do? So um, it goes back to that if you refresh in your mind that policy cycle towards the end was the monitoring and assessment part. So, as a researcher, if we continue to keep gathering data and information about what impacts policies are having, that can either reinforce a good policy or provide a counterbalance to a policy that you think is inappropriate. So that's the best we can do. That's the best tool that we have in our hands is scientific evidence. Cool. I'm looking at Tiffany. I think we're getting close to the end of our time. How much time do we have left?
Yes, we have 8 minutes till the webinar concludes. But I was just wondering if there's any additional questions coming in through chat. I think we covered them all. Um, the thing with Zoom is they don't tell you if someone's typing or not, so we'll give a few seconds. Otherwise, I think, yeah, we can give back. Oh, yeah,
Okay,
there's,
Aram has a follow-up question.
yes.
Okay. So I think thanks for explaining that a bit more. Internal policy versus external policy, or I would say internal policy versus a public-facing policy. Uh, yes, and so I think your understanding is generally correct that internal policies are typically ones which are not really shared outside. So sometimes we have policies that we would not, as universities, share even with students, because they are related to functioning of mechanisms or appointment of faculty and staff, etc. So those are internal policies. And sometimes there would be outwards facing policies. And so, yeah, I think you can call them external or public facing policies. Um, and I already mentioned that government policies can take different formats, anything from legislation and an act of parliament to like in the US, there's a presidential executive order is also a policy. And you can have, uh, government actions which are driven through, uh, executive decision making, kind of similar to what I described earlier as these large scale projects being designed and pushed through by the Canadian federal government. Okay, I think we have run through all the questions.
Well, thank you so much, Adil, for the wonderful session.